Are black people in Canada called African Canadians? Lived in Canada my whole life and have never heard the term African Canadian. We typically just say black. We typically just say black. I'm black and Canadian and people refer to me as Jeff. Well, I am black and Canadian and people simply refer to me as black, Canadian or Quebecois. I think adding Afro or any similar prefix would be useless. Edit. Well, this is starting to blow up lol. Yes, if someone needs to describe me or something, they would just say, the black guy over there. But my point is, they wouldn't say, the African Canadian guy over there. My parents immigrated from Africa, like a lot of fellow black people here. In official forms, they won't say African Canadian neither. There are a lot of bad answers here. Canadians don't center race in quite the same way as Americans. Like Americans will probably be used to having identified their race on thousands of forms. Canadians rarely do. When Canadians are asked about their background, we usually use the fuzzier term ethnicity, that has a lot more nuance to it. Black people in Canada usually just use the term black with a capital B. Occasionally you will see the term black Canadian, which is usually only used if meant to distinguish Canadian black people from other black people, or sometimes in a political or historical context. Like you might hear someone say, Lincoln Alexander was the first black Canadian MP, but you'd rarely hear a person call themselves a black Canadian. There is a lot of nuance to this. Black Nova Scotians, sometimes called Afro-Nova Scotians, are a distinct group with a unique history. They are the descendants of escaped enslaved people from the U.S., many of whom fought for Britain in the War of 1812. And then subsequently they intermarried with local Indigenous peoples. Because Canada didn't have a significant history of slavery, there were less than 1,000 black slaves in what's now Canada when slavery was abolished in 1833. Most black Canadians are immigrants from post-WWII or their descendants. The largest groups are from Jamaica, Haiti, Nigeria, Ethiopia, France, via its colonies, and the U.S., i.e. African Americans. As you can imagine, these groups have very different histories and cultures. This is very different than the U.S., where 85% of the black population are descended from people who were enslaved in the U.S., and from that experience, share a common cultural heritage. Often these groups don't move to the same parts of Canada and don't speak the same language. E.g. Jamaicans speak English and 85% live in Ontario. Haitians speak French and 90% live in Quebec. There is some sense of a collective identity among Afro-Caribbeans, i.e. black people from the Caribbeans. I'm guessing it's mostly Americans answering this given how ridiculous some of these answers are. Usually they are just considered black. However, if they are recent immigrants or still have a strong connection to somewhere else, then sometimes they will self-identify as X, i.e. Zambian, Guyanese, or an American who actually identifies as African American, etc. I blew some American's mind once and he kept doubling down that my friend's Zambian husband was a African American, when he wasn't. Hadn't even stepped foot on American soil in 20+ years, but somehow he was an African American. What's wrong with just saying black African Americans? Just seems really wrong to me. They call themselves black. I'm African American, and I call myself black, and so do most black Americans. The only time I really hear African American is when white PPL say it. In most cases it's appropriate to just call them Canadians. Fun fact: the vast majority of black people in Canada are immigrants or descendants of recent immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa. This is in contrast to the US, where the vast majority of black people can trace their ancestry to slavery in the 1600s. Black people have been in the US longer than Canada. I am Canadian, and we call black people black. A few of the black people I know will say they are French, if that is the language they speak more than English. People who have immigrated here will say, I am Nigerian, Dominican, etc., for whichever country, and then add that they are here studying or working. I've asked a few coworkers what they prefer, and they just say Canadians. Adding a person's geographic origins next to their nationality is an extension of America's deep culture of racism, connected to roots in racial segregation. While we all acknowledge that each of these groups, African America, Asian American, Mexican American, etc., are all designations of immigrating to the Americas, notice how white Americans are never referred to as European Americans, and how Native Americans are never referred to as plainly American, but are distinguished by an unnecessary redundancy. Only white Americans get to be called American, unless us non-whites travel outside of the US. Then we're just Americans. But in our own country our race always comes as a descriptor first. This is because America has a cultural problem with race that sees white people as a centered norm, and all others as unequal deviations from that norm. The only countries that decided to racially categorize its own citizens, native-born to that country, are the countries that were colonized, displaced the natives of the land, and then brought in other people from other places and decided to call them other. I have a black friend from Canada named Brandon, and I just call him Brandon. Haha, no, we're not racist, so we just call them Canadians. No, we just call them Canadians. No, that sounds stupid. They're people. They're Canadian. And they happen to fit the descriptive word, black. They're just called people here.
No.
I usually call them by their names.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Ericast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.